Good afternoon. It's a privilege to be here once again talking about stigma and its impact. We'll be continuing to talk about stigma with the title of Diverse Populations, Diverse Needs, and the Many Faces on Stigma in College Campuses. I had a wonderful PowerPoint, but it disappeared. So I'm going to have to do this verbally. But it's good to be here, and welcome back. We have wonderful panelists from all over the country who will be sharing with you their experiences and their knowledge on stigma. First is Dr. Sherry Molock from George Washington University. She'll be talking about depression in African-American students. And Dr. D. John Lee, Assistant Director, Michigan State University Counseling Center. He'll be talking about Multi-Ethnic Counseling Center Alliance Program. And Dr. Rudolfo Altamirano from the University of Michigan at the International Center. He'll be talking about depression in international students. And Dr. Stephanie Pinder-Amaker, Associate Dean of Students at the University of Michigan. She will be talking about Real Men, Real Depression campaign at the University of Michigan. And Dr. Howard Liu from the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Michigan will be talking about mental health, the hidden faces of the model minority. The issue of stigma is a very powerful word personally for me, because as I was going through, by the way, my name is Daniel Pack, and I'll be moderating this afternoon. And I went through psychiatry residency here at the University of Michigan. Despite psychiatry residency, when I suffered and struggled with depression, it was so difficult personally for me to admit that I was going through depression. And so I never received treatment. And the impact it had on me was very powerful, the stigma. And so personally, I understand what the impact of stigma, what it means for many people in different cultures. Culture where I come from was an Asian culture. And my mother, when I told her that, I'm going to study psychiatry, and she said, why don't you become a real doctor? And it was, I understood what she meant, but at the same time, I felt very sad. And talking to a student at the University of Michigan here from Asia, and as a professor, this gentleman would talk to me without any problems. And once I told him that I'm a psychiatrist, he stopped talking. He stopped coming to me to talk about his issues. And I asked him, what happened? He said, you're a psychiatrist. And when I talk to you, I feel like I'm crazy. And so I don't want to talk to you. And then I said, no, put that down. I'm a professor. Okay, I can talk to you as a professor, but not as a psychiatrist. And so we began to talk about his issues. So just some examples how powerful the stigma is in a personally and in society and culturally. So we have a diverse panelists here who will be discussing about some of these issues. Before I introduce the first panelist, we have some handout that's available for you. If you don't have the handout as you were coming in, please raise your hand and we will distribute that to you. Our first panelist is Dr. Sherry Molock from George Washington University. She's an associate professor of psychology. She studies depression and suicidal behaviors among African-American adolescents and young adults. She's particularly interested in the role of spirituality as a protective mechanism for depression and suicide among African-American community. I asked her, is there anything else that I should tell other people about you as I introduce her? She said, well, maybe this. She is a clinician, a researcher, and also a minister. So let me introduce Dr. Molock. Would you help me welcome her?
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. I understand we have 10 minutes and we're being very strict about the time, so I'm going to get right to the point. I'm also, in the interest of time, you have your slides in your handout in your binder, but I'm going to skip some of the slides also in the interest of time. I do want to also indicate, though, I do think it's important for you to understand that I do bring all three hats as a clinician, as a researcher, and also as a minister to my work. And I'm going to be focusing more on suicidal behaviors in African-American college students because my very esteemed colleague, Dr. Nell Prim, will be talking with you all this afternoon about depression in college students in much more detail. Just as a brief introduction, suicide is the third leading cause of death. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, for African-American youth between the ages of 15 and 24, and the suicide rates are highest amongst 20 to 34-year-olds. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for all college students, but we really don't know the suicide rate for African-American college students. There has not been a definitive study on that at all. Why is it that we don't know that? I think part of the reason for that is that, unfortunately, in the psychiatric literature until about the 1970s, we thought that African Americans were too unsophisticated to experience depression, particularly if you use the Freudian model, and so they were sometimes described as being happy-go-lucky people who had no cares, and so if in a Freudian model they had no sense of object loss, and since they didn't have object constancy, they couldn't have object loss, therefore they couldn't experience depression. Another reason, though, is because up until probably the mid-60s or late 60s, when people classified suicides, they typically classified them as whites and non-whites. And so one of the things that I always sort of jokingly tell my colleagues, you're a member of a stigmatized group when you're defined by negation. And so I think even unfortunately today you can read journal articles that describe ethnic minority groups into one lump and describe them as non-whites. And so if you think about that, we don't say non-males or, I don't know, non-graduate students. And so you should define people in an affirmative as opposed to a negative way. Just briefly, some cultural differences in the expression of depression and suicide. We know that African Americans are less likely to use drugs during a suicide crisis. We know that there is some research that suggests that the behavioral component of depression may be more pronounced in African Americans. So, for example, African Americans are much more likely to complain of somatic complaints, body aches and pains, as opposed to talking about and expressing feelings of sadness and blue. Some African Americans may express little suicide intent or depressive symptoms even during an emergency room crisis. And this certainly has happened to me clinically, where I've sent patients of mine to the emergency room to have parents call me back at 2 a.m. and say they're back home, they weren't hospitalized. What happened? They were evaluated, they denied the suicide attempt, they said they weren't feeling depressed, so they were sent back home. There's a concept called victim-precipitated homicide, or you may have heard that as suicide by cop. There's been a few studies that have been done, mostly in the East Coast, that have suggested that African-American males in particular and Latino males may put themselves in situations where the outcome that they would be, the likelihood that they would be killed or harmed by law enforcement agencies, but also by peers, is highly increased. We know that suicide is a stigma in the African-American community, and there's some debate in the literature about whether it's more stigmatizing in that community. And we also know that in terms of suicides, that there are differences in classifications in suicides, and so African-Americans are also the most, of all ethnic groups, are most likely to be misclassified. Okay, I'm going to skip some of the information about risk factors because, again, Dr. Prim will cover some of that. I do want to say a little bit, though, that there is some suggestion that having negative attitudes or religious objections to suicide appears to protect not just African-American college students, but also African-Americans in general. And my own work has suggested that family support is a very important protective mechanism for suicide. Okay. Now, jumping to interventions. We know that most university-based interventions try to increase public awareness, and we've certainly talked about that a lot this weekend, and also trying to increase help-seeking behaviors in students. So these are just some questions I think you need to think about in thinking about designing interventions and prevention programs. We know that, for example, that communicating factual information alone is not effective in changing health or mental health behaviors. And we also know that, particularly if you're thinking about public service announcements, advertisements, brochures, the messages that typically can change behavior focus on outcome expectations, normative beliefs, which is where my research is really focusing on lately, and self-efficacy beliefs. In the past, many interventions have been aimed at students, present universal messages, and what we have to think about is we're assuming that the universal message has a universal appeal to all audiences. These messages typically presume that African Americans have the same risk and protective factors as the majority group. It assumes that the behaviors of depression are similarly manifested in majority and minority groups. It assumes that behavior is equally salient and or important to majority and minority groups. And it also assumes that help-seeking behaviors and coping are similar in both groups. For example, we know from lots of research now that African Americans are much more likely across all age groups to go to clergy for help. We also know that mental health professionals and researchers tend to think of clergy as informal sources of help, and the research suggests that African Americans themselves think of them as formal sources of help. I also know in my own clinical work, what I do, although I do traditional cognitive behavioral therapy with my clients who are depressed, I don't call it therapy, I call it counseling, because when I call it therapy, people feel that that means they're really sick. And when I call it counseling, then people think they're just having a problem that they need some help with. So the labels that we use are very important. Should we target, and this is something in terms of looking again at PSAs or looking at brochures for African American groups, because the concern has been raised that if you develop a public service announcement for African American community, that the destigmatization of suicidal behaviors will remove potential protective bias for the community. But the issue here, and this is an empirical issue that we really need to do more research on, it assumes that stigma is protective. And that's something we don't actually know. It also assumes that destigmatizing something normalizes it. We do know that stigma is an important barrier to mental health treatment. So if we wanted to reduce stigma, at what level would we reduce it? Certainly Dr. Corrigan talked about this. There's an issue of self-stigma and then there's public stigma. So if you wanted to reduce stigma, would you try to reduce it at the level of the individual, to reduce shame about seeking help? Would you want to do your interventions at the community level? So change community attitudes and behaviors or perceptions, or reduce discrimination? Do groups who already feel stigmatized due to race or ethnicity have a greater resistance to being categorized in another stigmatized group? Certainly, anecdotally, this is what my clients tell me all the time. Do we have to have another pathology? I don't want to be seen in the group that already is painted, particularly by the media, as having so many problems. I think a good example of this is we look at the AIDS crisis in the African American community, that for many, many years it was difficult to get African Americans to seek treatment for AIDS, to even be tested for HIV, because of the stigma associated with homosexuality, particularly in the faith-based community. And so what happened is you saw this rapid rise in new HIV cases, particularly amongst women and children, and when that almost reached an epidemic proportion, then people began to pay more attention to that. So that's a good example of people, not the only reason, but one of the issues is that when people are already stigmatized, to be in another community that's already stigmatized too, as Dr. Prim will talk about later on, represents a double stigma. Does hearing one has a biochemical imbalance mean the same thing to all ethnic groups? We do know from some research that African American and Asian Americans are more likely to attribute mental illness to social causes. Now, we talk a lot about calling depression a mental illness because that's what it is, and I'm not saying that that's not true, but you also have to remember your audience. If your audience's understanding of causes to a particular illness are social and or biomedical, and you come strictly from the biomedical model, then what tends to happen is that the audience completely stops listening to what you have to say because they don't think the message fits into their schema. If you wanted to promote help-seeking behaviors, which ones would you promote? Given that seeking help from formal mental health professionals is stigmatizing in some minority groups, would a message emphasizing seeking psychotherapy be helpful? This is a model that we use. This is based on Cassie's research, and we've actually added to this model. But basically, it talks about how do people seek help for mental health problems. And one of the things that we have to acknowledge is as professionals, we tend to define problems epidemiologically. So we have a system, a DSM-4, we have a symptom checklist, and if you have the following symptoms, then we decide that you're depressed. But most people who are living in the community define their need for help based on perceived need. And most of the time, people do that when they're not able to function on a daily basis is when they make the decision to seek help. And so there's obviously a discrepancy between when mental health professionals think you should seek help and when people in the community feel they need to seek help. And then the decision to seek help, particularly for college students and adolescents, is it coercive? Is it a condition of going back to school, going back to the classroom, or is it voluntary? And then where do you seek services from? Many students we know of all ethnicities will seek help first informally, from family members, from friends, and from clergy and folk healers. And we also know that in the African-American community, if people seek help from clergy, they are much less likely to seek help subsequent to that from mental health professionals. There are also collateral helpers, school counselors, juvenile justice system, and then formal mental health professionals. So in conclusion, I just want to suggest that you need to consider developing culturally sensitive interventions for students that consider both the sociocultural context of both the student and the providers. We need to, for example, think about developing partnerships with faith-based organizations. This is not a panacea. That in itself has potential, which could be another talk all by itself, has potential advantages and disadvantages. In some faith-based communities, suicide is considered to be an unpardonable sin, and so you would have to take that into account. For some faith-based communities that are Christian, dealing with mental health interventions is considered to be akin to not having faith. And so those are the things that you would all have to consider too. But on the other end of that, we do know that people who participate in faith-based communities tend to be more integrated into a community and tend to have better support systems. So it's also an organization that's already indigenous to the community, it's already widely respected, and it's already highly utilized. African Americans attend church more than any other ethnic group in the country. And so it's a place that's potentially rich as a support system. And then you also need to develop partnerships with other cultural forms, including fraternities, sororities, Black student organizations, et cetera. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Molock. And I apologize for the time limitation. As you listen to the panelists, you may have questions. Please jot down your questions. After the panelists are all done, we will collect the questions and we will try to answer most of the questions that we have. Next speaker is Dr. John Lee, Assistant Director at Michigan State University at the Counseling Center. He is a clinical psychologist and coordinator of the Multi-Ethnic Counseling Center Alliance called Mecca at Michigan State University. Mecca is an MSU counseling center that provides variety of culturally and racially sensitive services to the MSU community. He has received his Ph.D. in cognitive cross-cultural psychology from Kansas State University and contributed to editing several books and articles. And he's also has such a great passion for basketball. And he wanted me to let you know today. So can we welcome him, please?
Thank you, Daniel. That's right. I mean, if this conference was in the evening tomorrow or Friday, I would not be here. Go Green. Sarah Newland, Dr. Graydon, and Lynn Dumas, thank you for your lovely hospitality. Far better than Ohio State and Notre Dame. Way to go. So what is Mecca? I had a handout that was given out to you. There's one-page sheet, and then there's this lavender brochure. What is Mecca? It's a pronounceable acronym. My apologies to any Muslim folk, and, you know, I mean, they just, back in 1969, I wasn't there. I've only been at State for 6 years. Dr. Thomas Gunnings founded what was called Mecca. And the Multiracial Counseling Center Alliance wasn't pronounceable. Ethnic really means race. Okay? And I want to be really explicit about that. Okay? Dr. Tom Gunnings founded Mecca because in a predominantly white counseling center, I think he was the only African American there, he recognized the need, right, to actually target minority, that was the word that was used back then, student populations at MSU. There were white people in the initial Mecca, so it wasn't just people of color. And it's still that way. But it represents 35 years of what I've called on my handout there, phasing out stigma. Okay? And I'm just playing with words there, right? And basically the message is that we approach stigma among ethnic minority, racial, ethnic communities at MSU by providing a face to mental health services. People don't necessarily come see a counselor at MSU. A lot of my caseload is people have come to see John. Okay? So let me say some more things. Who is Mecca? 7 core members whose job descriptions explicitly specify responsibilities to service racial ethnic communities within the MSU student body. Okay? How is that explicitly laid out? I mean, you could say it in the job description, but what do we actually do? I have 5 initial contacts during the week. Last semester is a little bit different this semester. One of those initial contacts is devoted to a person of color. If it doesn't get filled, it usually gets filled later on, okay, by a day or a walk-in. Okay? But it's institutionalized in our counseling center that students of colors can see us. Okay? Who's us? These 7 core members, right? 3 African Americans, and I want to name names here, not to drop names, but to emphasize these are people, not programs. Carmen Gear, Dr. Colius Johnson, and Dr. Charlene Patterson, who also serves as our director of the counseling center. 1 Chicano American, Ramiro Gonzalez. 1 Native American First Nations, Dr. Tawasina. 1 Japanese national, Dr. Hihumi Onishi. And myself, and I identify as an Asian American when we're addressing issues of race and racism. There are 5 doctoral interns who participate in Mecca. They are part of a multicultural seminar that lasts 1 year, and we also involve them in our outreach activities. So let me name those people. Okay? Now, their racial identifications will vary from year to year because they're just there for a year, but we currently have 2 African Americans, Saz Madison from Central Michigan University, Rosalind Davis from Ball State. We have a Native American, John Gonzalez from the University of North Dakota, and 2 Euro-Americans, Mary Ball from Western Michigan University and Janet Kinney from Michigan State. Again, I'm not name-dropping. These are people. Right? There are 5 other counseling staff members that participate in Mecca. 2 African Americans, Doris Wilkins and Carmen Lane, and 3 Euro-American white allies. Ann Flesher, Dr. Ellie Bossi, and Dr. Jen Gregoric. Ann also identifies as a lesbian white ally. And I also have to mention, because he's in the crowd today, Dr. David Novicki. Why is he an ally to me? Because when we're meeting and we're off-site, he's in the counseling center covering for us. Thank you, David. But notice what's going on there. 12 of 20, or 60% of the MSU Counseling Center staff are people of color. Racial representation is critical. So if you're from a university counseling center and you're one of 2 people of color, you got to start talking to the president and the board. If you're really serious about diversity, you need racial representation. Because the perception of a counseling center depends upon what the racial representation is. And also, I'm not talking about competency at that point. It's just the perception. That may sound racist, but it's real. Okay? 17 out of 20 of the staff at the MSU Counseling Center actually participate in Mecca. That's 85%. It's an institutional and it's clearly a commitment of the counseling center to address the needs of students of color. What do we do? In addition to our individual and group counseling caseloads, each of us are involved in what we call COPE. Counseling, it's an acronym. Consultation, Outreach, Preventative Education. For example, this week, tomorrow I will be giving a presentation on interracial dating at the Asian Pacific American Forum that's held at Lansing Community College. On April 2nd, I will attend the annual Asian Pacific American Women's Conference. On April 11th, I'll lead a discussion on a relationship conference in a residence hall. And on April 16th, I'll give a presentation on Asian American identification at a new conference we are hosting on Asian adoptees. I'm outside the office. Some of you are going, this is a different model, isn't it? Yeah, it's community psych. I clearly do in the office, one-on-one, individual therapy, but I'm also involved in community psych outreach. Does Mecca work? Oh, let me put one thing. This is an important paragraph. The kind of outreach and community involvement that we do puts a human face on MSU's Counseling Center. It has been my experience that APA students are more likely to make an appointment or drop in to see John than they are to seek mental health services through the Counseling Center. Mecca puts a human face to counseling. We confront stigma in our target populations by developing relationships with our constituent communities. Does Mecca work? Take a look at the back of my handout. There's some data there. There's some tables, okay? Look at those. Look at the data on the back of the handouts. Consider the racial ethnic breakdown of the clients seen at the MSU Counseling Center over the last 5 years. Compare that against the proportion, right? Compare that against the racial ethnic breakdown of students at MSU. Notice what's going on there. The data suggests that the students of color of MSU actually utilize the counseling center. Right, I'm glad some of you went, because you know the data out there. Some of you know the data. Most research shows that people have kind of underutilized college counseling centers and other mental health facilities. Why? 3 reasons are usually put forward. There's the cultural encapsulation of the mental health professions. Many of you know Western and Euro-American models of human development, normality, and change dominate our training. I was trained in those models. It was only after I finished the Ph.D. that I was able to look at the psychologies of Taoism, the psychologies of Buddhism. Okay? The perceived racial insensitivity is the second reason why we underutilize college counseling centers. And that's that whole issue of racial representation. If there's no people of color on staff, how can it be racially sensitive? Now, I know that leads to a whole argument and document. We can discuss that at another point, but that's another reason. And the third one is the social and personal stigmas. Okay? Now, we're not the best thing in the world. Clearly, we have our own dysfunctions. I mean, if you were to spend a day at Michigan State in the counseling center, you'd see we operate like a dysfunctional family like anybody else. Okay? And we have challenges of confronting a multiracial staff. So I don't want to make it sound like we got it all together, and it's all this stuff. But clearly, I think the commitment to getting out of our offices and putting a face, right, to what we're doing is clearly important in addressing the issues of stigma. Let me make this comment, and my clock's going off, and Daniel hasn't flashed anything at me yet, right? Yeah, there it is. Okay. Please allow me to make this comment. On several occasions, I've heard the one strategy of destigmatizing depression is to medicalize it. That is, to educate the public about the biological or neurological basis of mood disorders, much in the same way that epilepsy has been destigmatized. I refer to this strategy as biological reductionism. And it is appropriate for some individuals and some cultures. But it is not always appropriate, especially for some Chinese individuals, some of whom over-somatize their emotional and interpersonal problems. Some Chinese people tend to mask their relational and familial difficulties with medical conditions and think that they can resolve these issues by taking a pill and altering their body chemistry. For example, I've had several Chinese clients present stomach aches, back pain, and headaches when it turns out that the primary issues are academic or familial. I certainly take somatic complaints seriously, but I also take a client's psychological and relational development just as seriously. Here's a quote that came over my email today. "Medicine cannot be found for a sickness that is hidden," written by a Haitian proverb. Okay? It has been my experience that some Chinese people need a good dose of indigenous psycho-spiritual traditions hidden in Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and even Catholicism, where human suffering is managed through what Europeans have referred to as mentoring and psychotherapy, significant relational dialogues that embody humility, forgiveness, and reconciliation. But please do not misunderstand me. I'm not advocating some sort of psychological or spiritual reductionism where all problems, including mania and psychosis, are reducible to psychological or spiritual conditions. I know people who do that. A variety of metaphors are necessary to address human suffering. It has been my experience that psychotropic medications, especially the SSRIs, are an important treatment practice for depression. But as a psychologist, you know that I'm committed to psychological interventions as well. I encourage the psychiatric, psychological, social work, and religious communities to continue the tough work and conversations that address human suffering from a multicultural and holistic perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rudolfo Altamirano. He is the director at the International Center at the University of Michigan. He has conducted numerous, more than 200 cross-cultural communication, conflict resolution workshops, conducted more than 100 cross-cultural mediations involving international domestic students and faculty, and won numerous accolades and awards for his presentation, and gained back-to-back best of conference presentations at the Association of International Educators. This is important because I was part of that. But he has done so much work in the intercultural work, both in the secondary schools and college, university, government institutions, and the health services. And he will be talking about depression in international students. Dr. Altamirano?
I'm Rudy Altamirano, and I was a former international student. How would you feel if an international student approached you and he's very depressed in your own professional diagnosis, but he explains it as, because I was cursed, there was a voodoo inflicted on me, or I did not obey my dad, and maybe he has disowned me, and that's affecting me psychologically, and he is not forgiving me? or I'm just confused and I'm getting crazy, but I don't want to admit it. As a former international student, I came here in winter 1983. I was cold. I was lonely. I was very anxious. I have no money. If I have wings, I would have flown back to my country, even though it will take me thousands of miles away. I'm glad I survived, but not a lot of international students have done that. Post 9/11, things have changed. More scrutiny for our international students. They're already proven guilty before they're found innocent. And so when you're dealing with international students, the one thing I would like to, before I start my PowerPoint here, is that we should not put and lump them in a box or in one basket. Because a German is different from a French, from a Nigerian, from a Kenyan, from a Japanese to a Korean. And it's, my topic is depression for international students. I'm not an expert for 125 cultures here, but I'll give you the practical aspects of dealing with people who are not Americans. When you're dealing with the issues of depression for international students, we should remember that you will go through and you'll be peeling onions and layers because it's very complicated. I divided my issue here when international students are facing depression and stigma into two things. The first thing is difficulty in connecting and dealing with interactions. A lot of our international students that I have talked to and conversed with through the years have complained about not being able to connect. They cannot fit in. America is so huge. The university is so large for me. People are not understanding me. It's so bureaucratic. They listen, but they're not actively listening. Number one. Number two, they feel that they continually are given the high expectation that they have to represent their culture. You're from Japan, so you know all the culture about Japanese. Or you're from the Philippines, so maybe you should talk about the Chinese culture. And we all look alike for a lot of people, and that's the beginning of the confusion here. Another big issue is the ethnocentrism. They deal with students who are not accustomed dealing with people from another culture. I remember walking in Grand River when I was doing my grad school at Michigan State University, and this carload of undergrads stopped and said, "Hey, Chink, where's your boat?" I don't know what to answer. I was looking for a boat because I don't know what they're talking about. And then days later and weeks later, I asked about that, and I realized that that was an insult, a derogatory remark. When it comes to disclosure about your own personal problems, it is very difficult. For us, for a lot of international students, it will be seen as very disgraceful. And I come from a family. Leaving my country before I came to the United States 22 years ago, my dad, my late father, told me as an advice, "Rudy, you will be a guest of America. You have to behave. Don't shame us. Don't shame yourself. Don't do anything stupid, because it will affect not just yourself, but your family and your society as well." And that remained in my mind, because I'm not representing myself, I'm representing my family. A shame to myself will be a big shame to my family. The issue of admittance and enrollment is so huge now, especially with 9/11. Homeland security is huge. You cannot take an under-enrolled class, or you cannot just drop a class without being seen as an unlawful in terms of the eyes of immigration. So our international students are struggling with that. When it comes to cultural obstacles, a lot of these are familiar to you. But when you're asked to debunk your myths and stereotypes in classrooms and even in daily conversations, that's a very difficult thing to do. And I continually are faced with that kind of challenge. Number 4 in this slide is the biggest, where a lot of cultures perceive mental illness as reflective of hereditary flaws or inadequate child rearing. And I talked to you that this will bring a great shame brought on to the entire family. If I'm dating a woman who I believe has some issues of mental concerns, I know that my family will say something about that, because you don't want to marry into a family with some mental issues, because they will say that that will continue to be a big problem for generations after generations. And I'm not alone when I'm talking about that kind of concern. Another obstacle is there's not a lot of culturally knowledgeable or culturally self-aware counselors. I think I will be idealistic to say that if I have a choice, Mecca is doing a great job, or our counseling and psychological services here in the University of Michigan is doing a phenomenal job in reaching out to our internationals. But to reach out to our 125 represented countries will be impossible. However, that is a reality. It's a realistic need in order for us to meet the needs for mental health concerns. And a lot of my colleagues here have talked about, if I'm feeling aches and stomach pains and all of those things, I would attribute that first that I'm really sick, that I'm physically experiencing that because maybe I did not sleep well, or maybe I just have a headache, or what more, maybe I was not forgiven, or maybe I was cursed. The last thing in my mind is because I have some issues of depression. So what for me are the creative strategies that can be utilized by mental health professionals? One is having a diverse staff. I think that's very critical. If we can, in our universities and colleges, be willing to focus on this attention, I think this will help. I will not go to a center when I see that I'm the only non-white person in that. Let's be aggressive in public education. We are advocates in this room, in this auditorium. So let's continue to do that. Increased networking. I think that we're doing this now, and I'm beginning to see a lot of work in this area. In terms of location. Use multi-use facilities where there is non-psychological services provided to ease the worry and stigma. If they see counseling for everyone who is, it will be hard for me to seek advice in that particular area or office. The next one is very important. Language accessibility is very critical. In a lot of cultures, language is the mirror to the soul. If you don't speak my language, and that symbolically, philosophically, and metaphorically, it will be hard for you to understand me. Involve the representatives from the international community in designing, planning, and implementing mental health services. I think, personally, we lack a lot in that area. We have to involve them. I think the Band-Aid approach is always used in a lot of contexts. We should stop doing the Band-Aid approach. We say, we know the answer, but we don't really actually know the question. And confidentiality, big piece, we know about that. Cultural enrichment for our staff is very critical. CRLT has provided an excellent job yesterday presenting in their theater group. I think we need to do that, but we have to involve internationals in order to do that. When I do presentations, I always involve internationals. They feel good. They have the sense of identity, a social identity, which is very critical. In conclusion, culture counts. Culture and society play pivotal roles in mental health, mental illness, and mental health services. We have to understand the wide-ranging roles of culture and society to enable the mental health field to design and deliver services that are more responsive to the needs of racial and ethnic minorities. One piece of advice, I think we have to think of creative ways. Maybe instead of saying, I think you are in depression, and I think you need psychological help. Let's think of 101 ways to say that in a different way. Because if you ask me that, if you tell another colleague about that, I will not seek help. Because you already judge me, because I'm depressed, and you secondly judge me because I need psychological help. And lastly, when you deal with an international student, treat him or her and that she is or he is a part of the family. Even though they're thousands of miles away, you have to look at him or her with the family as part of the package. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rudy. Our next speaker is Stephanie Pinder-Amaker. She's the Associate Dean of Students at the University of Michigan, and she'll be talking about Real Men, Real Depression campaign at Michigan. She is responsible for counseling and psychological services, critical incidents, and is responsible for counseling and psychological services, at the Sexual Assault Prevention and Awareness Center, and services for students with disabilities. She also chairs a mental health work group at the University of Michigan and serves on the executive committee for the Depression Center. And she told me not to mention anything about basketball, so I won't mention anything. But she is one of the, someone who has such a passion, advocacy for mental health issues among campus and among the particularly students. So would you help me welcome Dr. Pinder-Amaker?
Thank you. I'm very excited and pleased to be a part of this panel this afternoon, and really pleased to have the opportunity to talk with you today about the Real Men, Real Depression campaign here at the University of Michigan. Briefly, you may actually be familiar with the Real Men, Real Depression national campaign. This campaign was launched in April of 2003 throughout the United States in various metropolitan areas. In short, there were three primary goals of the campaign. One was to educate people about depression in general and depression in men in particular. Two, to reduce the stigma of depression in particular and of mental health in general. And then finally, to encourage people to seek help when needed. If you were here at last year's second annual Depression on College Campuses conference, then you may have seen the presentation by Clarissa Wittenberg from NIMH. She came and participated in the conference last year and presented the national rollout of the Real Men, Real Depression campaign. And it so happens that the director of our University Health Services, Bob Winfield, was at that presentation and really liked the campaign and asked, why aren't we doing this on college campuses? Came back to the advisory committee and we decided, why not us? Why not try to seize the opportunity to tailor the campaign to a college campus and roll it out for the first time in a college environment? And so out of that, a collaborative effort ensued. Three big partners in this collaboration. The Division of Student Affairs teamed up with the Depression Center, and of course the third partner was the National Institute of Mental Health. And collectively, we put our heads together to figure out how to tailor this campaign to a university campus. Under the auspices of these three areas and slightly beyond, in order to do this work systematically, we found it important to bring some additional key partners to the table. And for us, for our university, those key partners included, first and foremost, our students. I can't tell you what an integral part of the process from start to finish they have been. Incidentally, the campaign was launched on our campus a month ago, almost to the date, and it will run through the semester and shortly beyond. But the students, for example, I can't say enough about how much they helped us to do our best thinking about tailoring this campaign and rolling it out on campus. But I think in particular about one of our first meetings with the students, and we were working with all of the materials that NIMH had sent to us, and we were picking and choosing from those materials, trying to select the images that we thought would resonate in particular with college students. And the older ones among us were very quick to discard one image, for example. We said, no, we think he's too old. The students said very quickly, no, we like the earring. We think he could be a graduate student. And so his image, as you'll see, continued to be as part of our campaign. Other key partners for our campus have included, of course, counseling and psychological services, university health services, university housing, a very key partner in tailoring and actually rolling and disseminating the information throughout the campus, the Director of Research from the Division of Student Affairs, our Vice President of Communications, our Psychiatric Emergency Services, and finally, the Dean of Students Office. So, how did this campaign actually manifest or come to life on the University of Michigan campus? It took these forms. We decided to create table tents and had those table tents distributed throughout all of the residential dining halls. Table tents, if you don't know, they are triangular placards that are, thank you, they are triangular placards that have the campaign ad material information, and they are literally placed on every single place where students come for dining services. We created bus posters. If you've had the opportunity to ride the campus buses while being here, then you've probably seen these large bus poster ads. We chose to print some of the larger 1 by 2 foot posters of some of the images. We created brochures, of course. We chose some of the public service ads and have been running them on our closed circuit television system within the residential halls. We created a press release that then generated a number of additional stories about the campaign. There was a story, a really nice story that was just picked up by the Ann Arbor News this last Sunday, focusing on one of the key members of the campaign. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then all of these materials were distributed throughout academic units. We put a special emphasis on getting the information in our various athletic facilities, intramural facilities, as well as, in the intramural facilities, as well as all of the other sports facilities and counseling center offices within athletics and throughout the university unions. In addition to these aspects of the campaign, there are a few U of M sort of special features I'd like to share with you about the campaign. We decided in this collaboration to dedicate a hotline that would travel along with the campaign materials. And so if you see these posters and these materials around, if a student is riding the campus bus, sees the poster, they'll see a hotline there that has been staffed, is being staffed by our psychiatric emergency services. So a student could, or anyone really on campus, could see the ad and decide to get some more information about the campaign, to learn more about depression, or to learn more about NIMH, or the resources at U of M, mental health resources in general. And they can get all of that information through the hotline. One really great aspect of the campaign, I think, has been the opportunity, because students were involved and because Psych Emergency Services agreed to staff the hotline, it created this wonderful opportunity for students to have a consultation meeting, if you will, with the Psych Emergency staff. And the students very systematically pulled for feedback from students university-wide about their experiences in calling in to the PES staffed hotline previously. And we came and met with the PES staff, and the students had this great opportunity, very empowering, they said, to share that feedback in a constructive way, to give advice on how they could best answer the phone when a student called in. Quickly, we know that our students are much more likely to surf the web than to pick up the phone, and so we also dedicated the university mental health website to the campaign materials, and similarly, that information travels on all of the materials. You can access that website in the resource room. We have an evaluation component of the campaign, and there are 2 phases of this evaluation. We are collecting quantitative analysis of the impact of the campaign, among other things. We'll have some ability to assess how many students actually see the materials and decide to seek help through our campus resources. And at the end of the campaign, at the end of the semester, we'll be running a university-wide web evaluation, a web survey of the impact of the campaign as well. In addition, we're going to collect some qualitative feedback from the students. We'll be running a series of focus groups later this spring in order to hear in a qualitative way what students experienced regarding the campaign on our campus. We are also just about finished creating a video documentation. We decided to create a very brief video documenting exactly what I've described for you today, but in a visual way. And the video will depict the rollout of the campaign on this campus. I'm going to show you at the very end of this talk, a tiny little clip from the video document. A final U of M, very special feature. We were really fortunate in this aspect, but from the original national NIMH campaign, the student member who participated in the national campaign happened to be a U of M student, Rodolfo Palma, and he's still available and on campus back in Ann Arbor. And he's just been a wonderful, wonderful participant in this campaign, and it's been fascinating to talk with him about his personal experiences and having this campaign rolled out literally in his own backyard. If nothing else, we might not be able to capture this quantitatively or statistically, but a very interesting dialogue has ensued between Rodolfo everywhere he goes on this campus. He's had police officers, students, staff members, all kinds of people approaching him to talk about his participation in the campaign and depression in particular. And here are some examples of the materials. This doesn't print really well, but it's a large example of this is what the table tent looks like when it gets folded. This is the bus poster. This is the student member, Rodolfo. This is the participant that the students fought to keep into the campaign because they liked the earring. And this is just a review of the brochure. You can't read that, but it's just to give you an idea. And then finally, I'm going to close by saying that it's our hope we're going to compile all of this information and the documentation and hopefully have some quantitative data to support the impact of this campaign. It's our hope that this work will, again, in partnership with NIMH, generate some interest in producing and rolling out this campaign nationally across college campuses. And I'm going to close by showing you a little segment of the video from the student participant, Rodolfo Palma. Press what? Oh, click on the black. Thank you.
I think that depression in men really mixes in, I mean, besides being, you know, the disease itself, mixes in its expression with what it means to be a man and a man's self-identity. One of the things that I'm glad about, I think one of the reasons I got chosen to be one of the people in the campaign was because there's not very many Latino voices out there speaking about depression. I know that with Latino culture, at least my end of it, there's definitely the roles of what it means to be a man, I think, are a lot more narrow. But there's also a part of there's also a stronger culture of silence where you don't talk about things in public, where you don't really, you know, not about the intimate parts of your life. And I think that makes
it's up here, by the way.
Makes it pretty difficult because a lot of dealing with depression means asking for help. And it means for asking for help wherever those resources are, even if they're not part of the community or part of your family. So especially being Latino, when that sense of community is incredibly strong, it's a lot harder to seek help from people who aren't part of the community, or even to acknowledge it, because I think the community doesn't necessarily see it as depression. A lot of it is just normalized male behavior. One of the things that I see about U of M's campus, which I think is really critical, is that you had both an institutional part of it, where you had leadership from the top, figuring out, you know, having, you know, allocating the resources, having a vision, and also having a long-term plan that can only really be effected if you have people who are going to be invested in doing something like this for a long term. But you also had students involved. I'm actually really proud that U of M is doing the campaign. It is the first university that's doing the campaign. Not just because I'm from here, but because, you know, being a really large institution and acknowledging the fact that that depression is something that is becoming, I think, more and more prevalent, you know, for a variety of reasons. I think it's really great that it's taking a leadership role in this. People have really responded positively. I think that depression in men really mixes in, I mean, besides being, you know, the disease itself, mixes in its expression with what it means to be a man and a man's self-identity. One of the things that I'm glad about, I think one of the reasons I got chosen to be...
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. If anybody would like to view this, you're welcome to come back on the stage and watch this through the computer after this. Our last speaker is Dr. Howard Liu. He's a house officer at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Michigan. He'll be talking about mental health and the hidden face of the model minority. Again, he's a first-year psychiatry resident at the University of Michigan. He has such a passion for cultural issues. He has done many, many things and chaired the Hate Crime Symposium, diverse coalition of 17 cultural groups during the medical school, in medicine, law, business, and undergraduates, to raise awareness about violence against minorities. His hope is to use his career in psychiatry to break down many of these stigma and address mental health needs in the Asian American community. And he told me that he's the most junior member of this panel group, perhaps, but I am certain that he has a wonderful presentation for you. Will you welcome him, please?
So I just want to thank you all for giving me the chance to speak. I actually am the most junior member of this group here. My MD was just minted 9 months ago, so it's a real honor for me to be up here with such a distinguished group of panelists. My talk is titled Mental Health, the Hidden Face of the Model Minority. And before you jump on me for that, I'm going to ask the question, are Asian Americans the model minority? Unfortunately, a lot of times in the media, we're portrayed this way. This is an example of, for example, the youngest person to get a perfect SAT score was an Indian American at 12 years old, which is pretty precocious. Here's another example, a distinguished Asian American. This is Dr. David Ho, who was the first to become a Times Man of the Year for Asian Americans for his work on AIDS cocktails and isolating the HIV virus. But unfortunately, this is really just kind of a caricature of our community because it doesn't really show you the more vulnerable parts, which are not often portrayed in the media. Here's one example. Just recently in Lancet in 2004, they reported that South India has the highest suicide rates in the world, especially among women. It's actually 148 per 100,000, which is about 12 times higher than it is in the US and about 70 times higher than Britain. So it's really in a kind of an astounding rate. Here's something from the news as well. This is, comes from Japan. In the last November, December, 26 people have met in internet chat rooms and committed suicide together in Japan. And here's something a little closer to home. This is a noted Asian American author. She wrote The Rape of Nanking, and she died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound just recently. So really, the model minority is a construction that I think is often portrayed in the media, but it really does a disservice to our community. It really highlights the superlatives, but it does so at the cost of those who have needs that are just really not being addressed. And here's just a little quote about masks and just the need to look beneath it, and sometimes it's a painful introspection. So my talk is going to focus on three things: the needs in our community, and then the barriers to care, and finally just propose some solutions pretty quickly. So one of the needs, so depression, overall depression rates from one of the largest epidemiologic studies was of Chinese Americans in the Los Angeles area, about 1993 to 1994, about 1,700 people. It found overall lifetime incidence of major depression was lower than the general population, 7% versus about 17%. However, if you look at specific populations, like the Commonwealth study looked at, I think, about 6,000 teenagers at grades 6 through 12 and found that actually Asian American adolescent girls were at higher rates of depression than any other adolescent groups. I won't talk about Semitization because Dr. Lee actually did a very eloquent portrayal of that before. In terms of suicides, there's actually overall less as well within the Asian American community. But you have to look again at the details. And here, actually, for completed suicides, Asian American women over the age of 65 have the highest suicide mortality rates of all groups. So you can't ignore an Asian American grandmother who comes in who's depressed. You can't really minimize their suicidal thoughts. PTSD is a special concern in our community for historical reasons. In Southeast Asia, there have been a couple of major really disasters and human rights issues that have unfortunately affected large members of the community. So the Vietnam War, we know, in fact, killed at least 47,000 US troops. But you have to realize that overall the war took 250,000 civilian lives just in South Vietnam, and people have estimated that up to 50% of the homes were destroyed as well. And overall estimates, some people have said up to 5 million people were killed. So it's really a tragedy on the other end, even after the war ended for us. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, during their reign of terror by Pol Pot, whose picture is in the corner there, claimed, some people estimate, about 1.5 million lives, and unfortunately traumatized the whole generations of Cambodians as well. So unfortunately, PTSD is not just a historical issue. In December 26th, there was a tsunami that basically rocked one half of the world. And sadly, even though it's too early to say, I mean, it's almost guaranteed there's going to be a new PTSD generation in that area of the world. Over 150,000 people were killed in Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and India. And when those people come over here eventually and emigrate, you have to be able to screen for that and recognize that that may be brewing in the future. Underutilization has been established in a couple studies, first noted here in '77 in Seattle. Asian Americans were noted to be less rate of them going into clinics, and it was also documented in LA County in '91. And really the barriers to care are several. One is language, one is lack of culturally competent practitioners, and the third is stigma. So language, it's pretty self-explanatory, but you might not know that almost 2/3 of Asian Americans are foreign-born even today. This is Census 2000 data. Over 100 languages are spoken, and an important fact is the linguistically isolated households, and that means that in these households, no one over the age of 14 speaks English very well, and fully 1/3 of Asian Americans live in such a household. And actually, if you break that number up, it's higher among certain communities. In the Hmong community, for example, it's up to almost 50%. So you have to really recognize that there's going to be great language needs. Culturally competent practitioners, a lot of the pioneering work has been Dr. Francis Liu at UCSF. He's basically, they've noted that there are fewer Asian Americans practicing mental health as proportional to the population versus Caucasians, about half. And they have found that utilization rates and its connection to outpatient care does increase when you ethnically and linguistically match the caretaker to the patient. So stigma, it's pretty evident. The issues of shame really are a barrier for people seeking help in the first place, and it leads to lower utilization and can really delay treatment. People might not seek treatment until much later when it's really unmanageable. Now, solutions. One of the things regarding the language issue, the class guidelines are a federal sort of mandate, and they come from the Civil Rights Act of Title VI, which states that any institution receiving federal funds cannot discriminate on the basis of race, origin, language, etc. So we really have to thank the civil rights movement for that. So what it means is that you have to provide patients standards in their own language, healthcare instructions. So they have to be free, they have to be written and verbal, and they cannot use minors as the translators. So it's an important issue. Education against stigma is done through really forums like this and ones that are going on like this across the nation. And we really need more culturally competent healthcare professionals, and that's been discussed by earlier panelists. So what you can do really is become culturally sensitive. So this really is three things: the attitude of recognizing the importance of it, knowledge of actual communities themselves, and actually skill in dealing with patients over time. So this is a three-part package. And I think people that are at this talk in the first place probably at least have the attitude and the knowledge, and really just become the experience. And second thing is that really you have to advocate in your community, because we all have a professional identity, but then once we leave the office, there's also a personal identity as well. You have a role in your community, whether it's through the church, whether it's through family or elsewhere. And unfortunately, if you are a professional, you might be saddled with the model minority myth, but use it to your advantage. You actually do have sort of an increased sense of respect for your community, and you can actually use that as a forum to discuss these issues. So since I'm Chinese and I'm from Confucius's province, I've always wanted to end with a Confucius quote. And so here's my quote. So, I hear and I forget, I see and I believe, I do and I understand. So what that means is, you come to many, many talks, and we really recognize that probably you'll forget, a lot of the things we talked about today. But I recognize to go out in your community and actually look around and see what needs there are, whether it's an aging grandmother who has suicidal thoughts or someone who's drinking. You really can do something about it. And the last step is really just to intervene and to speak up. So I just want to thank you for your time. Thank you very much.
That's a wonderful quote. Can I give you a minute or two to jot down any questions that you may have, and our assistants will collect those questions, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. And thank you for your wonderful talks. Okay. While you're doing that, if anybody have a question, there's a couple microphones that you could speak through.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The question, I believe, was one of the slides talked about in order to effectively change behaviors that you should look at outcome beliefs, self-efficacy, and normative beliefs. I think one of the things that we're talking about there, for example, if you were trying to increase help-seeking behaviors with mental health professionals in an African-American college sample or college group, one of the things that you really need to look at carefully in that system or with those students would be, one, do they believe, which would be self-efficacy, that actually going to seek mental health treatment would work? Because if people don't believe that, then you might need to end your intervention at that level. If there were cultural norms, and this is particularly something we've just submitted a grant for, we're very interested in looking at how social norms influence attitudes about help seeking, and how social norms influence that at different levels. So some of that is peers, that what do other college students who are friends, dorm mates, et cetera, think about seeking mental health treatment, but also what does your family think about that? And then what, if you're a part of a faith-based community, what does your faith-based community think about that? Because if there are conflicts at those three levels, you really have to think carefully about how you would address that. I can give you a concrete example. Last week, a young man, most of the therapy that I do in my church. And there was a young man who was home from college. I got a call from his mom. They were very concerned that he was very depressed. This is his first year at school. Came in, and talk to me. Now, one of the issues that he's going through is sort of typical freshman year. I'm away from home for the first time. My support system is not completely in place. I'm feeling kind of overwhelmed. He's a music major, which is very demanding at this particular university, so a lot of high expectations are placed on him, feeling inadequate. But part of the issue he's also dealing with is his gender identity. And so one of the things that he was really struggling with is how to come out to his family, how to come out to his peers, how to come out at church, all of which are in historically black context. And so if we were trying to get him to seek help, let's say at a historically black school, he really feels that he is triply stigmatized to try to do that. And so in order for us to develop interventions for him, we need to seriously think about all those contexts for him. And then finally, in terms of looking at outcomes, what's a quote-unquote good outcome for him? Would that be going to see a clergy person who might tell him, well, being gay is a sin, and so you need to pray, and that's it? Or would going to a counseling center, or perhaps finding a mental health resource for him in the community? And how, and for the parents in the audience who I've been listening to really carefully all week, at what level can we disclose or not disclose some of this with his family? Because certainly he has decided at this point not to come out to his family, but his family is very concerned about his depression, as they well should be. And sort of trying to coordinate all of that. And I think that if we're not sensitive to all those possible contexts, and particularly how they might conflict, then we might aim our interventions at the wrong level.
Thank you.
I have two questions from the floor. The first question is for Sherry Molock. Given that blacks express little suicide intent or depressive symptoms during suicide crisis, what extra measures should be taken in assessing suicidality with black patients?
And can I ask you to answer then 1 minute?
Yes, sir. 1 second. I think that you have to think carefully just about how to ask the questions. I think one of the things that I try to do is I share with students that sometimes when people feel depressed, et cetera, that they may also think about harming themselves. And have you ever had questions? Like, it kind of gives, rather than waiting for the student to disclose that to me, as I sort of give them permission that sometimes when people are depressed, that they may also be thinking about this. Is this something that you've thought about? And doing it kind of not in a, what I call a banner where like, da-da, are you suicidal? More I weave it into the conversation. So it's rarely the first thing I ask students. It's usually woven into, you're depressed, can you tell me a little bit about how you've been feeling, et cetera.
The second question is for any panelist. It's, can you comment in more depth on the risks of targeting interventions and outreach to specific racial, ethnic populations in terms of stigmatizing these groups? An example is there is an anti-violence against women campaign in Ann Arbor, and every poster put up shows a black male.
Would anybody like to tackle this question in 1 minute or less?
And just to add to that question, my question was kind of in relation to that, just maybe some feedback on some positive ways student groups can address the issue without coming across in that manner.
What was the second question?
Can you repeat the second question?
Let me just speak the first one. I remember hearing about that poster where it was an anti-violence, right? And then a black male was pictured. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes.
Okay.
It says there is an anti-violence against women campaign in Ann Arbor,
right.
And every poster put up shows a black male.
Okay, I mean, that's really racist, right? And whoever's behind the poster didn't talk to people and is just irresponsible with regards to the imagery that was being presented. And that's Rudy's comment about, you know, who were they consulting? Who were they talking to? Who was part of the committee that was behind the poster? And if someone's in the crowd that has anything to do with the poster, talk to me. You know, like, come on, that's stupid. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I mean, bring us to the table, right? Have us at the table. We would have caught that. Okay, second question.
Could you repeat the second question?
Oh, yeah, sorry. My question was mainly how can we tackle the multicultural issue without coming across in that way, is it best to, because I know Sherry Molock addressed how there are differences, but how can we come across as it being that we're not making them as negative differences and basically making it seem like we're outing that group specifically, and come across as we're just trying to inform the different cultural ethnicities?
I think that what John said is true. That I think if you just ask people and bring them to the table, I think even in the faith-based community, and I'm a minister too, I don't go in with assumptions. I go in and say, okay, what will work in your setting, and what would I do to offend you? And make sure, for example, in certain churches, I don't wear pants. Now, I think it's fine for women to wear pants, but I'm in their home, and so I respect their culture in their own home.
I was involved in the tsunami incident here in the University of Michigan, and one of the philosophical underpinning that I emphasize in the committee is before we do a vigil, for example, ask them, is the vigil what they want? And bring them in, because vigil is very American. So what do they need? And I think our university has done that, and that made it successful. I think we have to seek out. You just don't say, you're invited to this vigil. No one will come. They have to feel that they are part of the group and they have identification.
Thank you.
I would just add that that's a great example, and in that case, when we went to the students and asked them to help us think about how best to respond to the tsunami event, they helped us at every single level of thinking about that planning, including the name, and they rejected the title vigil. So then we went out very intentionally and did not use that word, for example. But it just began with the dialogue, asking for the feedback and the input and the guidance and the direction.
Thank you.
Hi, I know a couple of the panelists mentioned diverse or culturally aware practitioners, and I know at my university we have a very diverse student population, and I know individually when I do counseling I address any cultural limitations I may have and just put it out there and have the client educate me. So individually I can do that. Within our department we have ongoing professional development to address diversity and things like that, but I wanted to know what recommendations or suggestions you might have for increasing cultural sensitivity for practitioners.
To respond.
So by no means am I an expert on this, but I just, for the Asian American community, for example, there's Dr. Francis Liu did make an article which kind of proposes a curriculum for becoming culturally competent within the Asian American community, which really is really that triumvirate I mentioned before, which is it starts with your attitude. You know, you just have to have the open-mindedness to actually want to seek it out and to recognize your own kind of, whatever ignorant parts that we have that we don't know. And then the knowledge is the other thing. And that, unfortunately, that has to be done just through education. You have to read about the communities, you have to talk to them, and then skill is the last part, and that just comes through, I think, experience, just actually dealing with the issues day by day. But I think it has to be done in a systematic way, and I know Dr. Liu set it out for Asian Americans. I really can't speak of how it is for other communities, but
My response to that is we're used to attending cross-cultural workshops, more of head knowledge. I think it's very critical for us to develop interactions. The day-to-day interactions we have with our students are very critical. And if we're open to opening our doors to listening to them, we learn more than attending a conference. We have to be practical. Knowledge and understanding is critical, but empathy is the most important ingredient.
The first time I heard the Confucian quote was this way: what I hear I forget, what I see I remember, what I experience I know. I'm a real advocate of experiential techniques in therapy. I was trained in psychodrama. My suggestion for developing cultural competence is that you encapsulate or you really immerse yourself in a culture that you want to be sensitive to. I mean, Sunday morning is still the most racially segregated time. I mean, if you're a white Christian, you want to increase your sensitivity to another culture, change churches, change where you live. Now, those are radical suggestions, but I believe it's those kinds of experiences that lead to competence and not reading. Reading only is after the experience has occurred.
Just to concur, Two comments. One is that we actually teach this in our ethics class. So our students, in part of their ethics and development, professional development class, the entire class, we talk about competence, and we really strongly encourage students that it's not just enough to read about it, that you have to actually immerse yourself in the community. So we also try to match their practicum with their interest in terms of cultural communities. And then the students that work with me on the research, they have to come to the churches that we work in, which means getting up. If it's a 7 a.m. service, then they get up at whatever, and they come to the church and they stay the entire service. Because if they don't understand both the cultural and the spiritual issue of that, then probably we're going to at some point put our foot in our mouth. And once that happens, we might not ever be invited back.
It seems like it would be better to have something where it's a required part of your practitioner coursework. Because individually, okay, fine, I can make a difference myself, but it seems, I mean, the need is there. You're stating that the need is there. It needs to be done on a broader scheme, sounds like. Thank you.
Great question, great answers. We do have time for one or two more questions.
This question is for Dr. Altamirano. You suggested that we think of other ways to express to a student that we think or suspect that they're depressed and that they should seek psychological help. Do you have any suggestions for other ways to express that?
It's very different for every student. And so when I deal with international students, I really have to be creative. And the word depression is there's a stigma already in my vocabulary. So I said, what's happening with you? Is it okay for you if I suggest that you meet with someone who can help you with your classes or with your academe, or for you to be a successful international student? Because I know you're here for success. How can we make it? Sometimes you have to ask them. And it's very difficult because you have to be culturally competent to do that, because one wrong use of a word can easily turn them off. And when I suggest to them to go to the counselor and psychological services, it will take, not in that first meeting, maybe in the 5th meeting, and I have to do it in a very sensitive way. So depression is a tough thing to handle, and sometimes you have to use your family. How would your family, if your mom and dad are here, what will their suggestions be in helping you? Bring them into the open.
Thank you. I apologize, but I believe this has to be the last question, and they will be available afterwards if you would like to come up and ask and discuss some of the issues.
Well, I'm actually sorry then to take the last one, but first, I'm very glad we did this as part of the entire 2 days. And this is just a question and a challenge, I guess, to all of the panelists. All 6 of you have enhanced what I thought was somewhat decent awareness that I might have had about the importance of cultural competency. But I'm aware of the other problem that's been talked about for the past 2 days at the same time. So earlier we had conversations about the shortage of child psychiatrists, for example. Now, I live in a world where when we tried to address where are we with providers, you are all a shortage. I wish I had all of you on my faculty. And at the same time, knowing that there's a shortage and that there are too few people to treat, if you will, the mental health needs of the population at large, and then fewer yet who come from the same cultural backgrounds, what you've been doing today wonderfully well is challenging all of us to become better at it. But I fear there's another subtle barrier, and this is my challenge to you. And the other subtle barrier is that it's going to take voices from you to say to those that trust you, there aren't enough of us, you need to go to the following people, and somewhere getting the help is more important than not doing it. Because otherwise they remain those underserved that everybody was describing in their data. Howard, your data sort of shouted at it. And then as a result, you end up having higher suicidality risks and other things. So the challenge is, what can you do, what can you help lead to make the population of whatever terms we use, all of the minorities in America, more willing to seek out those few providers that are there that aren't of their same background, because there aren't enough of you.
Maybe I'll say something. I think what we need here is the issue of international advocacy. University of Michigan is a huge university, but I think there's still a long way when it comes to dealing with international education. The first thing that we have to do is the mindset that they are not transient, they're here only for a temporary thing. They will leave, the headaches will leave us when they leave for their countries. They're part of our university, and we have to be consistent in our advocacy, and we should not treat them as just individuals who are here for the tuition and here as visitors. They are part of the University of Michigan. And I urge you folks that when it comes to international education, this is a huge thing. I think they're overlooked in many, many ways.
Like all good things, it must come to an end. Quote, Daniel Peck.
Daniel Peck.
Thank you so much. Would you give a thunderous applause to our panelists? And let me introduce